Welcome back to the Injury Prone Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Edwin Porras, physical therapy, medical analyst, fantasypoints.com. Gracias por tus oídos. Today we want to get into a few players. The list isn't too long heading into week 5. Luckily, we do have some bye weeks, but first I want to remind you, if you want to know how running backs do off of a high ankle sprain, go down to the link in the show notes. Tap on the Injury Prone Draft Guide and Playbook. If you want to know how your quarterback will perform through an ankle sprain, go down to the show notes. Go to the Injury Prone Draft Guide and Playbook link. Tap it there. If you want to know how running backs will do after high ankle sprain, how long is Joe Mixon going to be out? Go down to the show notes, tap on the link to the Injury Prone Draft Guide and Playbook. You're going to get all that information, all that data to intelligently manage your fantasy teams, get an edge with the injuries right away. So before we jump into a couple of guys, a handful of guys here, I want to give another update on Rashee Rice. So what we know and what we've known on the whole situation, even though it's not a textbook situation, is that Rashee Rice is dealing with a knee injury that at this point we can relatively confidently rule out an ACL. It did look like it was going to be an ACL. Generally speaking, these things are an ACL, but it still doesn't mean that it's not a serious injury. So we know that based on the mechanism, like I mentioned on Tuesday, that it is likely a PCL or bone bruise type issue. Diana Rossini came out on an interview. She said that the timeline is they're going to do a scope on his knee, on Rashee Rice's knee, and that the timeline is either 6 weeks or 6 months. That sounds perfectly in line with a PCL sprain like we talked about on Tuesday. If they manage it conservatively, this is about a 6 to 8 week timeline. Think Puka Nacua. If they manage it with surgery, it's going to be a 6-month process, 6 to 8 month process, and he won't be back until next year. But it's pretty well aligned at this point, unless they go in and they visualize something they weren't expecting. Generally speaking, these PCL injuries are managed conservatively, but if they get in there and it's torn up, they might just go ahead and repair it or schedule a day and a time to repair it. So Rashee Rice, likely a PCL sprain. There's still a chance that he comes back this year, probably the fantasy playoffs. I would not count him out at this point quite yet. Don't drop him. If anybody's getting antsy and you have the roster room, if you're 4-0, if you're 3-1, you're relatively confident, go out and grab Rashee Rice. Throw a dart. Don't overpay for him. Obviously, don't drop another player that's contributing actively. But if you can go get Rashee Rice, go do it. Now we'll talk about Anthony Richardson, quarterback for the Colts. Obviously, came down on his hip and has a bit of a hip pointer, and they're also calling it a hip pointer and an oblique. So what we know about this situation is that he's been practicing, but we know he hasn't been practicing to the fullest extent. There are some beat reporters that are out saying that this is the least they've ever seen Anthony Richardson do in practice, and that Joe Flacco is getting a lot of the reps. This could be one of two things. He's actually legitimately injured, and he's just out there trying to move around. He'll be back in week 6. Option 2 is that they are going to use him sparingly, and that this is, some might say, quote, soft benching. Shout out John Proctor, potentially implying that this could be a soft benching. We'll see. Nonetheless, I do think that he's going to be active on Sunday. He could be the emergency quarterback. You probably don't want to use him in DFS. You probably don't want to use him unless it's a 2-quarterback league, just this week in particular. We'll see what happens with Anthony Richardson, but the injury is not very severe, so I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about him in the long run, unless, of course, he gets benched. So the next guy I want to talk about here is Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor, of course, dealing with a high ankle sprain. Rappaport initially reported that this was not a serious injury. I disagreed because, as you saw in the write-up or you heard on the podcast, this is Jonathan Taylor's 3rd ankle sprain, whether it's a low or lateral or a high ankle sprain since 2022. He's missed time because of this ankle. This is an injury history that we want to keep track of. He's out this week. On average, these running backs miss 2 to 3 weeks. Look at Joe Mixon. He tried to come back. Didn't work out. But Jonathan Taylor, high ankle sprain. I would continue to monitor him if you want to pick up. Obviously, waivers have ran. But if you want to go for Trey Sermon, I suppose that's an option. But there are probably better options out there on Jonathan Taylor. So I wouldn't expect him back until week 7 or 8 or so, depending on the situation. Last guy here, I've been getting a lot of questions about Brian Robinson. I know people are sort of panicking on Brian Robinson, but what I can tell you is that 42% of the time when running backs don't practice for 2 days and then they do practice, 42% of the time they end up playing. The production isn't necessarily harmed either. Now, what we don't know is if he'll be active, right? So there's about a coin flips chance that he doesn't play. And that would mean obviously more work for Austin Eckler. Depending on your league, how deep it is, how many bench slots you have, depending on how deep your league is and your settings and all that, you might be able to go get Austin Eckler on the low because we don't know Brian Robinson's status for the next couple of weeks, about a coin's flip worth of a shot that he'll play this week and he could still re-injure. Thanks again for tuning in. That's really it. Good luck in week 5.